Hey, good afternoon. I'm Jimi Underwood, and I will be giving the presentation Wildflower and Grasses for the Oklahoma Roadside using Oklahoma's roadsides for garden inspiration. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about a little bit about pocket prairies and using some wildflowers and grasses that can be found along Oklahoma's roadsides within these. Photographs of Oklahoma's roadsides and other locations around Oklahoma will be shown, and discussions of how these plants can be layered or used in the landscape to mimic prairies. Some of the common missteps and techniques learned from working with prairie and wildflower establishment will be discussed. So basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about pocket prairies and how to establish kind of a small prairie and some pitfalls and helpful hints. And then I'll go into some wildflowers that I've seen on the Oklahoma roadside that I'd like to see more of, and just really briefly cover a lot of those. So just an example, this is Highway 51 outside of Stillwater, Oklahoma. And yeah, just once you get up on the back slopes, there's actually a lot of wildflowers. So while you're driving around a highway or even the interstate, you may look and think the landscape doesn't have a lot of wildflowers, but really, if you slow down and stop and just look at the landscape, there's a lot of wildflowers throughout Oklahoma's landscapes. So let's first talk a little bit about pocket prairies. Prairies are small-scale flower beds or areas established as native prairies. They're usually geared more towards aesthetics, more so than ecological benefit. So that means they don't always reflect a true prairie per se, and more an idealized or what somebody has in their head. But it doesn't mean that they're not beneficial. And they can be created to reflect more local prairies or those of other areas. Like this image right here is at Myriad Gardens. It was a bed we were putting just annual flowers in, and I was given permission to kind of put some of the mix that across the path in the prairie just in the small bed and kind of create a pocket prairie. And so yeah, the gaillardia was blooming all last year and is beginning to bloom again this year, so very happy with it. So pocket prairies, these can double or be themed towards monarch butterflies or other butterflies, fireflies, lightning bugs, birds, spring or fall blooms, or many other options. So since you're going for a more aesthetic approach, and since the species list of prairies are actually very, very high, you can actually focus that a little bit and try to go maybe not as high species diversity as a true prairie would have, but something that's still going to be diverse, still ecologically useful, good for butterflies, good for birds, good for other invertebrates and insects. And then at the same time, just have something that looks great. In this image, this would be in the fall, that same bed, and you see the blanket flower still blooming, goldenrod starting the blooming, the sand love grass seed heads are up, and yeah, that's kind of what the airy little seeds are. On the other side of this bed, I had some asters in bloom at this time, I believe. And even just the seed heads from things like bee balm and lemon mint are very interesting at different times of the year in these little beds. So on to some helpful hints. Well, the first one I usually say is a good thing to start with is you need to start with your grasses and sedges and establish that base. Weed pressure is going to be one of the biggest headaches. And the next few slides, I'm going to mention weeds and how the headaches they can cause all the time. And so the grasses typically are very competitive and make a very good base. So in this particular bed, I have Sideoats grama, sand lovegrass, blue grama, some Buffalograss, and some little Bluestem. And since this was an annual bed, there really wasn't a lot of weed pressure. So I took just some wildflower seed packets I had lying around and added it to it. Those seed packets, I think, all had gaillardia, which is why the Indian blanket you can even see in this shot and is all over that bed. One of the unfortunate things is I would prefer a pure native wildflower mix, and some of my mixes were not. And so I pulled a lot of them before setting seed, but it looks like I didn't get some of the cornflower. So if you were to visit that bed right now, there is some cornflower and bachelor button, but most of this bed is actually all Oklahoma natives. Now, once you establish your base with your grasses or sedges, I like to diversify with plugs. Plugs kind of give more of a instant satisfaction, and you can kind of control the placement of plugs more. And as I talk in in one of the next slides, it helps overcome one of the other pitfalls. But if you are using seed mixes, seed timing, generally April on is a good time to start seeding your grasses. And then wildflowers, I really like seeding my wildflowers in the fall. I would say mid-October for central Oklahoma would probably be, I get the best results of. If you're in southern Oklahoma, you would wait until like late October. And in colder regions and the further north you go, you'll probably look at a little bit earlier October. You're trying to get a little bit of early germination and let the plants kind of germinate, grow a little bit, and then go dormant for the winter. And then they'll start blooming and rapidly growing a lot in the spring. It's very beneficial with your biennials like Texas bluebonnets, because if you time it just right, you will get blooms that next spring. But if they don't establish before that winter period, you're waiting another year before those blooms. So it is crucial that you start with a clean area. Bermuda grass, if allowed to remain in an area, will often outcompete native grasses and a lot of the other plants. Personally, I view it as a multi-year Bermuda grass control stage. Especially the larger the site, the longer it is going to take to get one of the prairie or pocket prairie even established. Some native groups use plastic soil solarization for 90 days to get rid of everything. A lot of other groups, myself included, I just use glyphosate, like a Roundup product. And usually late summer would be a good time to spray and monitor, and then maybe one more fall application. Then wait until a little bit later spring to seed or add your grasses, and it'll give you one more chance to go and make sure you got all that Bermuda grass controlled. So add wildflowers at least a year or two after establishment of the base. And this is just to help prevent with weed control. If you add wildflowers that first year, you limit yourself on your control measures the following years, and it's harder to monitor. And so usually I expect a year of just kind of grasses or sedges or kind of a base, ideally. Now, smaller beds, yeah, you can do them all at once, but the bigger the bed, I think it's better to wait. And if you're using something that is a little bit more aggressive, like a Buffalograss as a stage, as a base, you're probably going to have to redo your wildflowers every so often, because a healthy stand of Buffalograss will slowly over time kick some of those forbs and wildflowers out. So some potential pitfalls is Bermuda grass, as I mentioned before, and it is the #1 enemy in Oklahoma. In most parts of Oklahoma, Bermuda grass is just going to be more competitive than almost anything out there. It's extremely hard to control, and it's something that I am constantly scouting for in any bed. Total vegetation control is a good starting point, because starting with a clean slate, you kind of have a good idea what to expect, and then what your seed bank is. And then with total vegetation control, it's just easier to monitor. And depending on how you establish your base, if you go by a plug, since you usually plug in a pattern, it's really easy to walk a plugged field and kind of go, wait a second, this isn't along one of my lines, and then notice like, oh, this is something problematic, or maybe it's a nice surprise. This can easily be a multi-year process, and I would not rush the establishment of the base or the initial setup to these small pocket prairies or prairie, just doing prairie gardens. Prairie restorations and native lawns have and will fail if rushed, just because once you have a like Bermuda grass and Buffalograss, once it takes over a percentage, or even Dallas grass or a common weed like goosegrass, crabgrass, or some of the broadleaves, if there's just too much of it, you're always going to be playing catch up. Newly seeded, plugged, and sodded material will need water. I always make sure to mention this to anyone I'm talking to because some people, when they hear drought tolerant, like all these wildflowers and prairie plants are going to usually be, are not thinking, they're thinking they're drought tolerant for the entire process. And a lot of the native stuff, you really need to establish and treat it like a more high maintenance bed in the earlier stages. Drought tolerant and low maintenance are terms to describe established turf grass or even just established gardens or prairies. Um, like when you plant a new plant, you're going to make sure you make sure it's watered. And if you have a client that and you're establishing these wildflowers, they need to understand that too, that these aren't instantly drought tolerant, but once they're established, they are pretty tough. Weeding should be an ongoing process. Um, a lot of these things will just, some weeds are just so competitive, they're just gonna kick out and outcompete, especially in the earlier stages. And so just expect weeding to be a step that is going to be needed in the earlier parts of this. Now, after a few years or so, you're probably not going to really worry about weeding, and the prairie is going to kind of do what it wants to do. But in the earlier stages, you're really going to have to monitor and make sure you know what plants there and what plants you want there and which ones you do not. I typically don't fertilize a lot of mine, but in the earlier stages, I do. Like you can kind of see the buffalograss plugs, the little dots in this shortgrass prairie that we were re-restoring because when we seeded the first one, Bermuda grass was still in this field and was to the point that we needed to restart. But something like this, I would throw in a fertilizer and just to get more quick initial growth. But I wouldn't say fertilizer is a necessity in most cases that I have seen. I personally do a lot of hand pulling. I'm not opposed to the use of chemicals, but I really like spending the time in these little pocket prairies, getting to learn which wildflowers look like what when they're in seedling stages, and just what the birds or the insects or just whatever's around in these little fields. I just like spending time in it. So I do a lot of hand pulling, which can be time consuming, but there are other methods. The weeding is to reduce the competition. Oddly, I mentioned the buffalo grass will kick a lot of things out when healthy, but earlier on, a lot of these grasses are really just almost poor competitors, where broadleaf and just the wildflowers will, if they're there, they'll just outcompete the grasses, and the grasses will never truly get established. Yeah, and establishment, I usually say is 1 season plus. So, like you put out your grass seed in the spring. I wouldn't say that fall it would be fully established. It's usually the following fall. And that is just oddly remains true if you do a late summer seeding or even a winter dormant seeding. It just seems to take a little bit over a year to have your base established, especially if you're going from a seed and you're using something like a buffalo grass or blue grama as compared to the sedges. Um, now, prairie plant layering ideas. I like to talk about this a little bit because a major issue with working with prairie plants is public perception. I don't know how often I've been told just either remnant prairies or you create a prairie garden that reflects something more. And a lot of people are just going to tell you that the tall grasses or the lotta grasses or the different wildflowers, it just seems as unkempt and messy, especially when they're not in bloom. The informal nature of prairies can seem very untidy, and public usually expect strong design principles in landscaping. So if you're within a city limit, the public just naturally seems to want to see something that looks like intention. And just scattering a lot of seed and establishing and having an actual prairie sometimes doesn't look like the intention is there in the public's mind anyway. So here are some of my personal approaches. If you're doing like a home landscape, start with a grass only area along the street perimeter. I really like female buffalo grass clones for this area because they're going to look uniform. You can mow them or leave them unmowed, especially with Buffalograss. And it is that reminder to anyone who sees this site that this is intentional, this is being maintained, this isn't just being ignored. And then the next layer have taller or more mixed grasses with shorter forbs. Buffalograss, blue grama, some of the milkweeds, especially green antelopehorns or butterfly milkweed, some of the gaillardias, monarda, cowboy poppy mallow, clasping coneflower, bluebonnets, a lot of your other wildflowers that are a little bit shorter. So that way you start with a gradation. And so you get the short grass and then you slowly have a little bit more of a gradation. I see that there is a question. I'll try to answer all the questions at the end if that is not a problem. So to continue on the layering, the tallest plants I like near the back to continue that gradation. So your tall grasses like Indiangrass or big bluestem, little bluestems, aster, goldenrod, your other milkweeds like common, swamp, showy, your wild indigos, sunflowers, and many others are great in the back, and so that way when it looks a little bit more wild and unruly, or these plants are intolerant, at least you have that gradation, and so that way you create that, oh, this is obviously intended to look like this. Another way to approach this is to cluster the groups of forbs, your wildflowers, and taller grasses and just swaths. It may be more visually pleasing if the forbs look like thought out islands of little areas in each layer. So that way it is more intentional. And that doesn't mean it has to be like one species per island. Just put like maybe similar height or similar color plants to create some of these islands. And that way the design intent's there, and you might get less negative feedback because the site's going to look more natural. Now, covering that real quick, I'll actually go into some of the wildflowers of the Oklahoma roadside. So this is actually, I think, the only photo that I did not take in this presentation, and this came from Clayton Hurst. And this is just, I think, west of Henrietta, along the interchange from I-40 west to Highway 75 north. And the green, the creamy, the green, that is all Asclepias viridis, green Antelopehorn milkweeds. It's one of the monarch's favorite milkweeds. And so that being May of 2019, there's probably a lot of monarch eggs or larvae on those plants. I remember walking just the roadsides of Stillwater, and it was very common to find monarchs on these plants. So these roadside sites are being used by things like monarchs. You can also see some Indian paintbrush in this photo. Looks like maybe some Lanceleaf Coreopsis. And if I were to walk this site, there's probably a lot of different wildflowers just in this one photo alone. And a lot of Oklahoma's roadsides look like this. So Pale Coneflower, Echinacea pallida. This blooms May to July, pale purple coneflower. This can be found in eastern Oklahoma or southeastern Oklahoma. I was driving back from McAllister back to Stillwater when I kept on noticing just how much this echinacea was on the roadside. So I pulled over to the side of the road and stopped and snapped this photo. This is a very interesting plant to use, especially within grasses. I would guess this is probably Sideoats grama is probably the most common grass in it, just because the flowers just seem to kind of hover over the grass canopy, and it's just a very interesting look. Now, another echinacea I really like would be the black Samson or narrowleaf coneflower, Echinacea angustifolia. This one, in both pallida and angustifolia, you can easily find in the trade, and more nurseries are selling them and growing them, which is great. And so this was found off of Highway 51 outside of Stillwater, in between Stillwater and I-35. And this would be probably the most common echinacea I find in central Oklahoma. And it's really neat just to be able to walk on these roadsides and find things like echinacea. Other echinacea can be found and can do very well in Oklahoma. These are just two I wanted to bring attention to because one, really like them, and two, I'd actually like to see more of them in the trade and used more commonly in home landscapes. Indian paintbrush. If you've driven along Oklahoma roadsides just recently, this is the red flower that you are seeing a lot of. That, and then showy evening primrose is most likely going to be the pink splashes you see everywhere. It's also sometimes referred to as a prairie fire. And this one's very interesting because it's considered a hemiparasitic. It usually relies on a grass, and it will attach its root and steal some nutrients from the nearby grass. Although it does have chlorophyll and it can produce its own energy, it does have that parasitic nature. Because of that parasitic nature, this is very hard to find in the trade, and even can be difficult to seed or germinate. One of the websites I've seen, they suggest when seeding this is to take a pocket knife and go to your Sideoats grama, Buffalograss, or blue grama, and cut in the center of the grass clump and drop the seed about 1 inch deep. And that is one of the more successful ways to, if you're going to try to germinate itself. Now, onto a lot of the coneflowers. One of the reasons common names can get really tiring, especially in Oklahoma, is it seems like every other wildflower in Oklahoma is some sort of coneflower, even though some are closely related, some are not. And so these next three are all actually going to look somewhat similar, and they're actually all going to be typically considered different genus. So this is Dracopsis and Plexicalis. It is monotypic. It's the only thing in this genus. It blooms from April to July. It has the yellow with kind of the maroon leaves in the center. It is also sometimes referred to as Rudbeckia, and it's very similar to black-eyed Susan and prairie coneflowers, but it differs in how the leaves collapse to the stem. So especially on the image to the left, you can kind of see how the leaf is more heart-shaped and it really claps to the stem. And this one is, I see very commonly in a lot of the seed mixes. So this one's fairly easy to get a hold of. I think all of these next three are really easy to get a hold of. Next is your just common black-eyed Susan, or sometimes called brown-eyed Susan. I don't actually see these very commonly on the roadside. Now, in trade and in seed mixes, these are very common, but coneflowers in general, especially the Rudbeckia, in Oklahoma's roadside, especially north central Oklahoma, I see more of the collapsing coneflower and the prairie coneflower. But this can also have the same maroon center sometimes, or sometimes it can be yellow. The cone's a little bit different shape, and these leaves do not clasp the stem. There are, like I mentioned, a lot of different Rudbeckias. A lot of them do well in Oklahoma. I just don't necessarily see a lot of them in the roadsides, especially in north central Oklahoma. And next would be prairie coneflower, sometimes referred to as Mexican hat. So sometimes they have that maroon with kind of a yellow tip on the bracts on the petals, and sometimes they're all yellow. A lot of seed companies actually sell these. I think they consider this yellow one the prairie coneflower variety of the Mexican hat. And these you will see on the roadside. However, just from experience and from what I've heard, the more mature the stand is, or the more mature your prairie or pocket prairie is, this is one of the species that actually is going to become rare. It is just one of those that establishes on disturbed or weak sites. And so you'll see it a lot more on roadsides because there's always some damage or some work on roadside. you'll see it quite often. Now, Lanceleaf Coreopsis, bloom April to June. A lot of the Coreopsis are frequently called tick seed. If you ever get to look at their seeds, a lot of them very much look like little ticks. They can grow in small clumps and form large colonies. I've seen areas of roadsides dominated by this plant. Like Coreopsis beetle can be an issue. So if you ever have Coreopsis plants and you just see all these little tiny beetles on it, that's just an unfortunate plant with unfortunate thing with growing some Coreopsis. I do believe there are some things to control it, but I usually just have enough wildflowers that I just let them be. Now, I think between Guthrie and Edmond on I-35, I've seen a large stand of Lanceleaf Coreopsis growing. And when it blooms, it's really impressive just to have this huge stand of bright yellow roadside. Unfortunately, it likes to bloom roughly when ODOT's doing one of their mowings. So you do have to just catch it just in time sometimes. Another Coreopsis that I see a lot, very common just in empty fields or along the roadside, would be Plains Coreopsis or Golden Wave or Golden Tick Seed. Very similar to the Lanceleaf Coreopsis. The flowers itself are probably a little bit smaller, and then they do have that maroon center. This is a very just fun, interesting plant. Since it's not really compact, it usually looks kind of airy. It's kind of a neat addition to a lot of pocket prairies. And very similar to Lanceleaf Coreopsis in area. This is the one I probably see the most. Yeah. Now, Prairie Clover. Here I have Dahlia purpurea, the purple prairie clover, but also I've seen the white prairie clover, Canada and Canada, also along the roadsides. I just see the purple a little bit more. There are quite a few prairie clovers that I think can be found in Oklahoma and the US. This is one of the most widespread ones. I really like it in seed mixes or in little pocket prairies. One, because of the interest. It's a purple versus there's a lot of yellow and maroon, it seems. And so it's nice to throw in some purple coloration in there. And it is generally relatively fairly short. And so this is a really nice one to have closer to the edge or a little bit more up front. Now, the Indian blanket, the state wildflower of Oklahoma. Bloom period I usually see advertised as April to August, but I have had luck with these blooming from April all the way into November. So that big ice storm that hit Oklahoma City, I still had Indian blanket growing and blooming in this bed. So that's how I got this image of this Gaillardia just completely encased in ice from that particular storm. These are an annual, but they're just really easy to grow and have long bloom seasons and are almost in every mix I add. There are actually quite a few other blanket flowers that can be found in Oklahoma on the roadside too. Like this Prairie Gaillardia right here was off Highway 51. It's actually probably what I see most commonly out of the Gaillardias on the roadside. You can also find red dome blanket flower. That's going to be more in western Oklahoma. And a very interesting one, perfume balls or rayless Gaillardia, which doesn't have any bracts. So it's just kind of the red ball in the center. And I've seen that one in empty fields in just Edmond, Oklahoma. And then I've seen it off I-35 just south of Perry. And it's a really interesting plant. And although not as showy as like the Indian blanket or some of the hybrid or trade Gaillardias, I do think they're pretty and deserve to be used in prairies and marketed, just because they are some of the gaillardias that are native and you can find just on the roadsides in Oklahoma. One that you might not necessarily expect on the Oklahoma roadside is there is quite a bit of baptisia or false indigo. You can find blue wild indigo, white, and the cream or longback, all within Oklahoma. You can find them on a lot of the roadsides. Very pretty, kind of early spring and early summer bloom. And so add some really pretty blues or cream colors to your garden, and forms a fairly large size or kind of just shrub when it's happy, and really pretty to have mixed in the roadside. Very silvery foliage, especially in this one that I have a photo of right here. Now, goldenrod. There are quite a few goldenrods you can find in Oklahoma, and they're great for the fall. Yeah, a lot of people forget they add all these spring blooms and they forget to add plants that will bloom in the fall, so that way you can get that great fall coloration. I always like to point out ragweed's blooming at the same time as the goldenrods are in the fall. And so a lot of people like to blame their hay fever or allergies um, on the goldenrod when it's not. It's the ragweed. And one of the reasons why it's not the goldenrod is its pollen's actually fairly heavy. I think it's not a wind pollinated flower at all. I'm pretty sure it's insect dependent. And so it's not the source of your allergies in the fall. It can be very aggressive. If you don't have a good strong base, I've seen goldenrod just absolutely take over and you end up with a field of goldenrod instead of a pocket prairie or anything else. And once you have that, it's a fight to get other things to compete with this and get back to having more of a prairie stand. This would be off Highway 51. And this goldenrod's actually in between, I think, Johnson grass and switchgrass. So it's competing with two other very aggressive species on the back slopes off Highway 51. Now into some of my favorites. Again, the milkweeds. I love gardening for monarchs, and I really like seeing milkweeds in the gardens. So this is the butterfly milkweed tuberosa, Asclepias tuberosa. Blooms May to September. I've had extremely good luck growing this in my own gardens. I don't see it often on the roadsides, probably fairly rarely. I see the green Antelopehorns milkweed a lot more on the roadsides than I do this one. But if you're just doing a little pocket prairie or home garden, this is a plant that I almost add to seed mixes or anything, just because of the orange flowers and it does really well. Now, the milkweed you do see throughout Oklahoma on the roadside is Asclepias viridis. This used to be very, very hard to find nurseries growing, but I've started to see more and more nurseries offering this, which is great. This does really well in Oklahoma. If you drive down the interstate and you just see patches of yellow to green during this time of the year or the summer or even early fall, it's likely green Antelopehorns milkweed. This is one of monarchs' preferred milkweed plants. And so you will attract monarchs, most likely if they're in the area. This is one of the milkweeds they like to lay on as larval host. It is very similar to green Antelopehorns. However, the leaf shape of green Antelopehorns is going to be more triangular and pointed and not as wide. And so a lot of people confuse the two. In Oklahoma, with our rainfall pattern, it's typically going to be the green milkweed or green Antelopehorns and not the Antelopehorns, which is Asclepias asperula. There's a lot of other milkweeds that you can just find in different areas. This was off Highway 51 and I think a center median where the split highway in the middle. And I think this one is pine leaf milkweed, but there's also things like green comet, And if you're in the southeast Oklahoma, you're probably going to find more swamp milkweeds or showy milkweeds. And in western Oklahoma, you're going to get more into the desert tolerated milkweed plants. And monarchs will use all of these. Surprisingly, something like this with such a narrow leaf, you will find monarch larvae on. I think they usually would lay their egg on the flower and eat the flowers before necessarily leaves, but you'll be surprised what you can find. Um, these are really fun. A lot of these are just really hard to find in trade, no matter how interesting. But there's a lot of different milkweeds, and there's a lot of resources telling you which milkweeds are native to any area, especially in Oklahoma. I think the Kerr Center has a great milkweed guide that I would recommend checking out if you want to grow some different types or just learn about different types of milkweeds in Oklahoma. Now I'm going to go into some of the grasses. I do think grasses are very important to mention on just finding on the roadside or in areas or even using in these small pocket or prairie gardens. For instance, I think skipper butterflies, a lot of the skippers like green skipper, it's the grasses that are the host plants for some of those. And then birds will use a lot of the grasses for nest making. And then insects, just something to hide at in the day, like fireflies have a relationship with, I think, Sideoats grama, where it's where they prefer to be hiding in during the daytime and then at night is when they come out. And so because of this, I really like to push and suggest some grasses. So Buffalograss, it's low growing drought resistant turf. It's desirable on the right of way because it really, in a lot of ways, can perform like Bermuda, or if not better than Bermuda in some situations. It's very low growing. Typically on a roadside environment, I wouldn't expect it to get above 5 inches, meaning their mowers wouldn't even be able to mow this grass in most cases, because I think their mower decks are usually about 5 inches high. It's typically dioecious, meaning there are male and female plants. The male plants are the ones with the little inflorescence that stick above the canopy, like in the image on the bottom. They can be from a white to a pink, sometimes an orange or reddish color. And then the female holds its burrs within the canopy. And so when I mentioned using a female clonal type, is if you wanted just to use a female, you'll never have just random seed heads or anything sticking out of a female clonal type, just because it's going to just look like a single stand. And even though they're called burrs, you can walk across them barefoot. They're not sharp. They're not gonna poke you. Blue grama blooms summer to fall. Sometimes called mosquito grass or eyebrow grass. I've heard somebody call it mustache grass just the other day. There are some cultivars like Blonde Ambition that are getting very, very popular. I'm seeing it everywhere. But I just like using the straight species. One of the reasons it's called mosquito grasses is not because it attracts mosquitoes or anything, but as you can see from the images, I actually got a photo of it in flower, and so the little tiny flowers hanging beneath those little seed heads, to some people remind them of little mosquitoes just hanging underneath. So that's how I got the name mosquito grass. You can find this throughout Oklahoma, but it definitely likes drier conditions and can tolerate very low watering conditions. I think it can survive on as little as like 6 to 8 inches a year, which doesn't mean it won't look good all year, but it can survive on something as that little. And so as you travel further into western Oklahoma, you'll probably see more of this. In fact, in the panhandle on the roadside, I would think it would probably be better if ODOT crews, instead of trying to use Bermuda or even Buffalograss, we're trying to use something like blue grama, just because of how dry and how drought prone that area can be. Something like blue grama could survive, and it can be used as a turf grass and can handle especially a 5-inch mowing. Now, Sideoats grama, I think I'm beginning to see a little bit more in the trade, but I think this is a very pretty grass, especially when it kind of it's in flower, like in this image right here. has a kind of red, orangish, pinkish flowers. And I usually like to use Sideoats grama just to show people that yes, grasses do have flowers. They're just usually really, really small and not something you notice. Bloom summer to fall. This is probably the most common grass that I see on the Oklahoma roadsides. Um, it's most common in the central mixed grass region, but you can find this throughout Oklahoma, and it's probably the most prevalent out of the shorter grasses, and especially north central Oklahoma. Now, little bluestem, I think, is a very pretty grass, and you will see occasionally on the roadsides. I think as you get further south into the state, you'll see a lot more of it. It can look similar to broom sedge, which can be found throughout Oklahoma. Sometimes their fall colorations are a little bit different. This image that I have on the right is just wanted to show some of the different grasses. I have split beard bluestem, broom sedge, silver beardgrass, little bluestem, and then the introduced invasive old world bluestem. And I found all of these within the same field. And so, although a little bluestem is really pretty and you can find on the roadside, it's just one of many very similar looking grasses you can find throughout Oklahoma and on the roadside. So you really need to know what you're looking for. Out of the bluestems, you probably see more silver beard bluestem, which is in the center of the image, than a lot of the others on the roadsides. Now, Indian grass blooms August to October, sometimes just called yellow Indian grass. This is the state grass of Oklahoma. It's common on the back slopes throughout Oklahoma. I see it most commonly in the northern eastern part of the state, especially after years that we're not under drought or it's kind of rainy. The Indian grass starts to really seem to multiply and do well. And then when we hit a little bit drier years, you typically see a lot less of the Indian grass. I think it's another very pretty grass, and I think it's a good element if you want to use native plants and want native grasses instead of some of those introduced ornamental grasses. And it looks great in pocket prairies as well if you have the room to have a bigger and taller grass. And then probably the most common taller grass in Oklahoma is your switchgrass. It blooms August to November, and there's upslope varieties and downslope varieties. It can get really big and very aggressive. This is actually a problem grass on some of Oklahoma's roadsides because it can get into the first 15 to 30 feet, which we call the clear and safety zone. And a lot of switchgrass isn't going to be something that you can emergency drive your car over because it's so thick. And so that's what that first 15 and 30 feet's needed. And so this actually does become a problem on the roadside sometimes. But on the back slopes, it's a really pretty, really strong and great performing grass. It can get really tall and would be definitely one of the dominant grasses if you're more in eastern Oklahoma or central Oklahoma for the tall grass portion. There are a lot of wildflowers and a lot of different grasses I could have talked to. I really just kind of limited to some of the ones I really like seeing and enjoy seeing, and I think were really pretty, and I easily had photos of. I don't always take photos, and sometimes I don't save them into the right files, so I can't always easily find them. I'd like to thank you, and I guess at this time I will answer any questions. Okay, do I recommend signage while in progress? I've seen some cool signs like pollinator gardens in progress. Yes, Sarah, I do, and there's a lot available from different organizations. Another thing that is helpful, this one, Benjamin Voigt, who wrote, he wrote a book promoting just using native plants. And he suggests learning the Latin name as well. So that way, when your neighbor calls or somebody comes over and goes, oh, this is too tall or this is weedy, if you can tell them exactly what it is, no matter what stage it is, and even the Latin name of it, it usually shows that you have that intention. And a sign is a very good way to do that as well. Yeah, any other questions? Oh, yes. For fall planting in October, what would you expect in spring, say for bluebonnets? So I planted some Texas bluebonnets in Oklahoma City at the Myriad Gardens in a bed that did not have irrigation and has just kind of been ignored because it's along the drive right at the beginning, across from the prairie. And I think I planted it about October 15th. Um, they germinated and probably stayed in like little tiny rosettes. So if you're familiar with lupines, it's a typical lupine growth, like 5 little fuzzy little palmate leaves. And then I started seeing them starting to bloom probably about late March, right before April, and they're still blooming now. Uh, since it's not watered or anything, they might not be the most impressive bluebonnets you see, but I love seeing them. I hope that answered your question. But yeah, in the spring, I typically see them. They're in bloom right now, and they were starting to bloom, I think, late March, and that was with, I think, an October 15th or middle of October seeding. Um, the best practice for roadside establishment, drill, broadcast, or hydro seed, that is a difficult question. And that's actually something I'd love to do more researching in, because the nature of the roadside, I think they saw it if it's a brand new project and they had to strip it down to the ground. They just need something there quickly. But for the most part, they can't really do much outside that first 15 feet, trying to find ways to water miles and miles of road. And I think Native American Seeds outside of Junction, Texas, they do provide hydro seeding. But I think in how I would approach it is, if it's something's already established, I would probably just try the seed and hope weather cooperates. I'm not sure ODOT has the equipment, the drill, and I think hydro seed just might be too expensive for what ODOT might be doing. Now, personally, if it's just along your own roadside, um, I think drilling would be great. But a lot of these prairie plants do great, and you don't have to get them deep, so you could just broadcast them, and they do just fine. They do really well. Any more questions? Um, because this is going to be later showed as viewing, I went ahead and did not put my contact information, but I am sure you could email Summer or someone, and they can give you my email. That is not an issue. I will answer your emails. I just, because of the nature of the presentation, I didn't necessarily want to just post my email out there. Okay, Sarah asked if we already started a prairie, is it better to start over or keep pulling grass? It depends on how bad, like if it's Bermuda grass, it depends on how bad it is and how much effort you're going to put it in. Because if the bigger the Bermuda grass stand, the harder it's going to be to remove. And so, depending on your tolerance, of an introduced grass or a grass you don't want in the stand, you can just treat spots. But if it's like the whole field is really bad, sometimes it's easier to start over. But I mean, then you have the drawback that if you have some unique wildflowers that are doing well, then you unfortunately lose them. So first, go ahead and just, I guess, attack certain areas and that you know are problematic, and just be more aggressive the bigger or the more problematic an area is, and then re-diversify it over time. Or if it's just a small little area, uh, I just I hand pull Bermuda all the time. One of the things I like to do with Bermuda is I just very carefully pull the stolon up each where it roots and go all the way to the base, and then once I pull out the plant, trace those rhizomes as well.
All right. Any other questions for Jimmy before we go? Jimmy, thank you so much for being with us today. You brought so much good information to everybody. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed giving presentations like this all the time.
All right. And thanks to everybody who joined us today. And whether you're joining us live or on demand, thank you so much. We'll see you next time.